Have you ever felt like you were made of more, like you were carrying an entire ocean inside you while everyone else seemed content splashing in puddles? It's a strange thing, isn't it? To walk through life with your skin just a little thinner than most, your heart exposed like an open window in a thunderstorm. You weren't made to skim the surface. You were born to dive, deep, messy, unfiltered. You see what others miss. You hear the tremble in a voice that says, "I'm fine." You notice the silence that screams louder than words. While the world scrolls and swipes, you're still holding on to the echoes. It's not a choice. It's not a phase. It's a way of being. But when you carry this kind of depth, the world doesn't always make room for you. It demands efficiency, not empathy. It wants productivity, not presence. And so, you start learning how to edit yourself, how to smile when you're unraveling, how to shrink so you don't take up too much emotional space. They call you too sensitive, too emotional, too intense. But what they really mean is, you feel too much for their comfort. And so, you learn to wear masks. You perform lightness. You talk small when you want to speak galaxies. And that's the real burden, not the depth itself, but the loneliness that comes with carrying it where it isn't welcomed. You try to numb it. You go through the motions. You laugh at the right jokes, say the right things, blend in where you used to stand out. But the soul knows. It keeps score. It whispers at night, asking you to come home to yourself. Because this is more than a personality trait. This is soul architecture. This is what Carl Jung tried to name the introverted intuitive, the soul attuned to symbols, meaning, patterns that can't be seen but are deeply felt. You're not imagining things, you're perceiving them. But perception without permission becomes pain. When your inner world is denied, it turns inward. It starts to erode. And slowly, invisibly, you become a stranger to yourself. You wake up tired, not from sleep, but from suppression, from swallowing words, from pretending, from carrying emotions that don't have anywhere to go. The body aches, but doctors find nothing. The heart hurts, but you tell no one. And the question that keeps repeating is not what's wrong with me, but where do I belong? We don't talk about that enough. The existential exhaustion that comes from emotional repression, the fatigue that no amount of rest can fix. It's the price of constant self-adjustment, of living in a world that wants your smile but not your sorrow. And yet somehow you keep showing up with your cracked voice, with your soft strength, with your inconvenient truth. That's not weakness, that's courage. Because to feel in a world that rewards numbness is rebellion. To stay soft in a culture of performance is resistance. And to keep your depth intact, even when it isolates you, is perhaps the most radical act of all. So maybe, just maybe, the problem isn't that you're too much. Maybe the problem is that the world has forgotten how to hold people like you. But you haven't forgotten. You remember what it means to be real. To speak from your chest, not your script. To cry without apologizing. To listen not to reply, but to understand. You remember, and that memory is your power. Because the ones who feel everything are the ones who hold the map. The ones who still know where truth lives. The ones who make room for others because they've lived in the margins too long to ever turn someone away. So if you've been told to shrink, don't. If you've been asked to quiet, sing louder. If they've labeled your truth as too much, let it be too much. Let it overflow. Let it break the mold. Because there's a kind of strength in staying tender, a kind of wisdom in staying awake. And the world, though it may not say it needs you, even if it doesn't know how to hold you yet. There comes a moment, quiet, unannounced, when you realize the world you've adapted to is no longer the one you belong in. You sit at a table surrounded by people, laughter echoing off the walls, conversation buzzing like neon signs, and yet you're elsewhere. Not detached, not aloof, just unaligned. Your body is there, your smile rehearsed, your replies timely, but inside there's a stillness, a knowing. This isn't your language. This isn't your rhythm. It's like watching a dubbed film. The mouth moves, but the meaning is missing. You used to wonder if this meant something was wrong with you. If your silence in noisy rooms was a social flaw. If your craving for deeper connection was a kind of emotional greed. But now you see it differently. Now you know this is the cost of consciousness. You see, when you start living in tune with your inner world, the outer one stops fitting the same way. It's not arrogance, it's clarity. And clarity is rarely comfortable. Philosophers like Kierkegaard and Heidegger spoke of authenticity, not as a concept, but as a practice. To live authentically is to carry the full weight of being, to confront discomfort without anesthetic, to belong to yourself even when you belong nowhere else. That kind of living can't be compartmentalized. You don't just see the cracks in the system, you feel them. You sense the emptiness behind the pleasantries, the desperation under the performance, the loneliness wrapped in curated lives. And while others dance in the shallows, you're drowning in truth they don't want to touch. It's not martyrdom, it's perception. And it comes at a price. Because when your world is rooted in introspection, reflection, and resonance, you become foreign to the fast food culture of quick answers and convenient distractions. People don't always know what to do with someone who doesn't flinch at silence, who asks questions without rushing to fill them with solutions, who listens with their whole body. So they label you, they pull away, or worse, they try to fix you, wrap your depth in digestible packaging like an inconvenience to be managed. But you weren't made for packaging, you were made for presence. And presence in a culture of performance is radical. This is why connection for you is sacred, not just social, not just a pastime, but a form of communion. To be met without flinching, to be heard without interruption, to be understood without translation. That's rare. And when you find it, it feeds you, it heals you. But when you don't, it starves you. Because there is a hunger that runs deeper than food, a thirst that goes beyond water. It's the longing to be seen in your fullness without having to apologize for your depth. And this longing, this beautiful ache, is not a flaw. It's evidence that your soul is still awake, still reaching, still believing that there is something more. Not more people, not more attention, but more truth. So you keep searching, not for a crowd, but for a mirror. A space where your reflection isn't distorted. A moment where your being isn't too much, but just enough. And until then, you carry on. With quiet courage, with fierce tenderness, with a kind of resilience that doesn't always roar but never backs down. Because maybe your depth isn't a burden at all. Maybe it's a compass. And even when the world refuses to understand it, you keep walking toward truth, toward wholeness, toward home. Somewhere along the way, you stopped explaining yourself. Not because you no longer cared, but because you realized that some truths aren't meant to be trimmed into tidy sentences. They're meant to be felt, and those who can feel you won't need the words anyway. You learn the hard way that vulnerability can be a double-edged sword. Sometimes it connects, sometimes it confuses, but more often than not, in this world, it makes people uncomfortable. So you started choosing your moments, calculating the temperature of a room before deciding whether your soul was safe there. You began to rehearse lightness, perfect the art of being fine, and cushion your truth with a smile. Because there is a quiet kind of trauma that comes from being met with blank stares when you bare your soul. A kind of grief that grows not from what's been lost, but from what's never been received. You found yourself retreating, not out of fear, not out of bitterness, but out of self-preservation, out of exhaustion. Because giving your full self in a world that only wants fragments is a painful way to live. You carry the weight of every interaction that didn't land, every conversation that left you emptier, every time your authenticity was mistaken for intensity. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, you began to withhold, not as revenge, but as refuge. You stopped volunteering your depth to those who only sip the surface. You stopped pouring yourself into spaces that were never designed to hold you. Because while connection is essential, misconnection is wounding. And some of the deepest scars aren't from cruelty, but from indifference. But here's the thing. Your sensitivity is not a liability. It's your inner compass. It's the way your soul orients itself toward what's real. The world may reward armor, but you, your life, is a testament to what happens when you choose openness anyway, when you refuse to harden. It's not that you're weak, it's that you haven't given up on the idea that being whole is still possible. And that's rare, that's brave, that's beautiful. So no, you're not too much. You're just not meant to stay small. Let others mistake your silence for submission. Let them label your depth as difficult. You don't owe anyone a version of yourself that fits inside their comfort. You owe yourself the truth, the messy, glorious, soul-expanding truth of who you are. And the moment you stop apologizing for it, everything begins to change. The change isn't always loud. Sometimes it starts as a breath, as a moment of stillness where you choose, maybe for the first time in a long time, not to edit yourself. You speak and you don't dilute. You feel and you don't numb. You show up and you don't shrink. It's subtle at first, but it's a revolution. You begin to notice what nourishes you, the spaces that don't drain you, the people who don't need you to perform, only to be. You stop asking for permission to exist in your fullness. You start reclaiming every part of you that you once set aside to survive. It's not always graceful. Some days you'll still feel like too much. Some nights the loneliness will still sting. But even then, you won't go back. Because once you've tasted truth, the counterfeit won't satisfy. You'll stop negotiating your worth in rooms that require your silence. You'll stop twisting yourself into palatable versions. You'll stop waiting for the world to change before you decide to live honestly. And slowly, your life begins to match your soul. The conversations deepen, the connections root, the noise fades, the clarity sharpens. You learn that healing doesn't mean becoming invincible. It means becoming visible, letting your cracks show in the light, letting your scars become stories instead of secrets. You become a home for your own truth. And that's when freedom begins. Not the kind that screams, but the kind that exhales. Not the kind that fights to be seen, but the kind that simply is. Carl Jung said that individuation, the journey to becoming whole, requires us to face our shadows, integrate our contradictions, and emerge not as someone new, but as someone real. You were never broken, just buried. And now that you've returned to yourself, you carry a quiet kind of power, not to dominate, but to illuminate, to remind others that it's okay to feel, that it's safe to be seen, that depth is not something to fear, it's something to cherish. And maybe, just maybe, in choosing to live fully, you give someone else the courage to do the same. You with your soft fire, you with your wild heart, you with your truth-telling eyes. You are not too much. You are exactly what this world forgot it needed. Stay open, stay true, and when the world feels too shallow, dive anyway, because your depth is not your burden, it's your gift.